What's up, everybody? Joe here, Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, Kyle and I interview Natalie Ginsberg. Natalie is the MAPS Policy and Advocacy Manager, and we have a really cool discussion with her about the state of drugs kind of internationally, a lot of other really cool subjects. We get into some Ibogaine discussion, talk a little bit about the Trump administration and the future of drug policy for the next 4 or so years, to see what that looks like. And let's give you her bio here. Natalie earned her master's in social work from Columbia University in 2014 and her bachelor's in history from Yale University in 2011. At Columbia, Natalie served as a policy fellow at the Drug Policy Alliance, where she helped legalize medical marijuana in her home state of New York and worked to end New York's racist marijuana arrests. Natalie has also worked as a court-mandated therapist for individuals arrested for prostitution and drug-related offenses, and as a middle school guidance counselor at an NYC public school. Natalie's clinical work with trauma survivors spurred her interest in psychedelic-assisted therapy, which she believes can ease a wide variety of both mental and physical ailments by addressing the root cause of individuals' difficulties rather than their symptoms. Through her work at MAPS, Natalie advocates for research to provide evidence-based alternatives to both the war on drugs and the current mental health paradigm. As you can see, she's pretty well-versed in this material, and as we'll get into in a moment, she even got to go to the recent Vienna, what do they call this? Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna, and a really interesting, once in a blue moon UN conference on narcotics. I know psychedelics aren't really narcotic, but the UN clumps them in there somehow. So without further ado, I will just wrap this up here. If you want to support us, it would be great to have some more reviews on iTunes. You just go to iTunes, find the podcast. You will very easily find how to leave a review. You could just leave some stars, or you could type up some stuff talking about how you like it, or just share with your friends. Also important to share with you guys is we have developed and are working to launch a psychedelic integration and self-care course. If you want to see more on that, you can find it on our Facebook page, facebook.com/psychedelicstoday or psychedelicstoday.com or psychedelicstoday.teachable.com. And you can find what we're offering there. I think we're going to stop selling that one in about 30 days from now. So late January, it'll probably stop being on sale. So check it out. You might really like it. At the very least, you'll learn a couple things you didn't know before. If not, just how to proceed, how to get started, all that kind of stuff, and how to be safe, most importantly. So hope you enjoy it. Let us know what you think. You can reach out at psychedelicstoday.com on our contact page, or email us at psychedelicstoday@gmail.com. Enjoy the show. Bye.
Welcome to Psychedelics Today with your hosts Kyle and Joe. We're here with Natalie Ginsberg, Policy and Advocacy Manager at MAPS. Welcome to the show, Natalie. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess just let's jump in your background a little bit. And how did you get involved with MAPS and the policy and advocacy?
Sure. So kind of a windy road a bit. I was getting my master's in social work, and in that time my first year I was working as a guidance counselor at a middle school in the South Bronx with one of the highest poverty rates in the country. And then I was working also as a therapist with people arrested for sex work. And my work with these highly traumatized populations kind of got me pretty frustrated with our current approach to mental health. And I just felt like all the tools we were given were really about addressing the symptoms and not really about addressing the root of what was happening. So that was kind of bubbling and frustrating to me. And that work, I also started looking at, the policies and systems like racism that were in play that were really screwing over my clients. And then I started working the next year as a policy fellow at the Drug Policy Alliance to work on drug policy reform, because I saw that was really a huge driving force in mass incarceration and a lot of these really horrible policies that I was observing. So when I was working at Drug Policy Alliance with my kind of background in therapy work with trauma survivors, I started reading about MAPS's research, and something just really, a light went off. And actually at that point, I hadn't even really had personal experiences with psychedelics. enjoyed smoking cannabis and could understand how that was kind of a healing and inspiring medicine. But I just, from literally reading the research, got super interested in how psychedelic therapy could be a much more effective modality, and how by addressing kind of the root cause of the issues instead of just addressing the symptoms, it was actually a really radical, different approach to mental health in general, and really kind of confronted the pharmaceutical industry's whole approach of how can we get people to take pills every day for this profit-driven mode, when I saw psychedelic healing could work in as little as one session. So then I just started learning more about MAPS and reaching out to MAPS, and I got lucky to through DPA to be able to meet with some MAPS researchers who hooked me up with this adherence rating program. So I was super lucky to get to watch videos from the MDMA therapy sessions and get a really powerful sense of what was happening in these sessions. And then when I was reaching out to MAPS when I was graduating from grad school, luckily Rick Doblin, the director and founder, needed some support with his policy work. And at Drug Policy Alliance, I had worked to pass medical marijuana in New York, my home state. So I had experience doing that, and I got super lucky and been helping build MAPS's policy and advocacy team since 2.5 years ago.
That's really great. Yeah, I see a similarity with me a little bit. It took me about 7-8 years of reading the research before jumping in to psychedelic materials at all. And then breath work forever, but then finally jumping in after a bit. But it's really interesting. It's cool you're doing a lot in your home state too. A lot of people, leave and will just stay in California honestly, or something.
I did leave. I went to California. I had been doing work in New York at DPA, but then when I started working for MAPS, I left for California. So I'm one of those. But I will say with MAPS's work, the vast majority of my policy work is focused on federal and international policy. So I'm super grateful to be living in California, but I'm actually not really working so much on California focused policy.
Can you talk a little bit about what the international stuff looks like? International policy?
So this past year, the UN met for the first time in 20 years to revisit international drug treaties. The UN General Assembly, the special session, was called on the world drug problem. And so this was a really incredible past year of kind of convening the international drug policy reform community. There were a series of different meetings. Vienna hosts something called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs every year. So first there was a big gathering in Vienna where the leaders reformers from around the world, and non-reformers, but people working both from civil society on drug policy, kind of came to meet with delegates from around the world and educate them and tried to move drug policy from a criminalization approach to a more public health and harm reduction kind of approach. And then after Vienna, the General Assembly in New York in April hosted the kind of bigger, more unique one in 20-year meeting. And so that was pretty also inspiring. And though it was a bit frustrating in terms of progress, we would have liked the outcome document to reflect much more progressive drug policy stances, but they're very influenced by countries like Russia and China, who are really not open to harm reduction approaches at all. But I being there, you met so many, for example, the so-called drug czar, but he doesn't like that name. The national drug coordinator of Czech Republic, for example, is really supportive of psychedelic advocacy and was able to host a lot of kind of more innovative, progressive events. And collecting, the Colombian health minister gave a really powerful speech on the floor of the UN, basically saying the drug war, using that Einstein quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, which was really epic for this, the minister from Colombia to be saying that to the whole UN. But overall, like for me, what was so valuable was really this coming together of the international reform community. Now I work super closely with advocates from literally Afghanistan, Mexico, Nigeria, like being much more in the same loop of what's going on and kind of learning about how we're doing work in different countries, like is super important, because the UN is a really slow body that is quite reactionary, and it's really driven forward by individual countries' progress. So the more we can support individual countries moving forward, the better chance we have for them to kind of influence the UN later. So that's been a really cool and like personal, I used to do Model UN in high school, and definitely never imagined I'd get to be going to the UN to talk about cannabis and psychedelics, but it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's got to be some experience to stand in front of those people and talk about this stuff.
It really was.
Are there any star countries that you noticed that are really like doing stuff that might not be on the radar yet? We know Portugal and Switzerland, and like I think Bolivia legalized marijuana fully recently or something.
Uruguay.
I knew it was a U.
Bolivia actually has legalized coca leaves, and has done some really important work around kind of protecting cultural indigenous plant medicines and like promoting the traditional use of these substances. I would say depends on like in what areas. Like as I mentioned, Czech Republic is really, I would say, the leader around all things psychedelic and that are not quite as like not traditional indigenous use. And I would also say that though Portugal gets a lot of attention for decriminalizing drugs, they actually weren't the first place to do that. Czech Republic has been decriminalized even longer than Portugal, as has Spain. Spain, it was also before Portugal. But Portugal got all this attention because they did it in response to a big opiate crisis. So there are some incredible results to show how dramatically things have shifted. But other countries have kind of taken that stance for a while, so there isn't as much of a shift. But they do have really promising like results from not having a crazy drug war. Spain is also really cool because of cannabis social clubs. I was lucky to spend a few weeks in Barcelona this fall. They have these incredible spaces that basically was like a mix between a coffee shop, coworker space, maybe a little bar, or, worked in there. There's just like a community space where you can go you join the club, and then once you're a part of the club, you can use cannabis. They'll come bring you like a bong or rolling papers to your table, and just a really cool, got me thinking about a lot of things, especially because this to me is like a model that they're trying to remove profit from the cannabis model. And in the US, we do see how big business is driving cannabis reform forward pretty quickly. And so it was really powerful to me to see kind of other modes. I was really excited by this kind of community space. I was dreaming about the day in California where we can have a social club. I mean, maybe we need a better name, but like a hangout space with cannabis, where maybe you have a shared garden with the community where you're growing cannabis and vegetables, maybe psychedelic mushrooms one day too, and you can it's just kind of a different mode than this like consumer buy, sell, and like just being, I guess I'm concerned when we see the impact that profit has on the pharmaceutical industry. I do have concerns about what that would do to things like the cannabis industry. But sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place with other countries. But also keep an eye on Colombia. They're kind of still in process of reforming their drug policies, and though they haven't like made as dramatic of strides as the other countries, a lot of the ministers and people doing work are kind of a lot more conscious, and they see all of the horrible impacts of the drug war on their country. So I think they will kind of continue to like do this work and lead some reform in South America. Then also, of course, Canada is leading the way in so many ways on the drug policy front. I'm half Canadian, super proud.
Nice.
It was incredible. Even at the UN, actually, the Canadian, like the representative from Canada's speech made all of the Canadian drug policy reformers I was working with, like, literally start crying. They're like, we've been working for this for so long. Just to see them speak in that way, you know, from legalizing cannabis to really strongly supporting all the harm reduction measures with in response to opiate crises. There are just really a range of things. I think Canada is going to be a leader on drug policy reform and probably a lot of other policies as well.
So let's talk about Iboga, because we're talking about the opiate crisis, the international scene. And sure. We talked earlier that you're getting involved in the Iboga movement to a degree with MAPS, I guess being the sole policy person working that stuff. So what's going on in the Iboga world?
Well, I guess I'll kind of be more specific about sure. MAPS's role in that, which is that with Ibogaine and Iboga, the research that we have available is, for the most part, kind of is observational and not so-called clinical, like the type of rigorous research that a lot of the kind of medical community relies on, which, you know, is problematic in its own way, like what types of research are valid and not. But regardless, you know, we do feel like we want to work with the community so that they're open to learning about these substances. So MAPS, as a research organization, is interested in trying to develop, you know, more the type of research that medical community and politicians would be more open to understanding. And so ICEERS is this group based in Barcelona. Are you guys familiar with ICEERS?
Sounds really familiar. I think I've heard of them.
They do really incredible work. They're more focused on ayahuasca and Ibogaine, but also cannabis and greater drug policy reform. They have started something called the Ayahuasca Legal Defense Fund. So when people are like in trouble for, you know, with the law for ayahuasca around the world, they will put together kind of cases that, like, you know, build a network so they can help support one another. Like if there's another case that comes up, they can more easily reference past cases in other countries and trying to put together jurisprudence. But anyway, so they're doing an Ibogaine study in Barcelona. But because Barcelona has been decriminalized, you know, they have had decriminalized drug use and harm reduction practices, they don't have an opiate crisis anymore, but they do have a lot of people using methadone for long periods of time. So their study is using Ibogaine to get off of methadone. But what's really exciting about their protocol, and what we're definitely looking to work and adapt their protocol for the US, is that Ibogaine is usually kind of used in these like big heroic doses, and that can be a really difficult thing to integrate, and also can be a bit dangerous. I mean, with the right precautions, we can definitely dramatically increase the safety profile, but, you know, things still happen. And with their protocol, they're using kind of titrated smaller doses and building up so that it's an incredibly high safety profile, and it isn't just this big, like, crazy dose. And it's helping, so even a really small dose of Ibogaine can block withdrawal symptoms, which I think is something super powerful in the US to even start speaking about, because we have so little tools, even so few tools to help just those withdrawal symptoms. And I think that's a lot more kind of manageable to start dealing with these like imperceptible doses that are blocking your withdrawal symptoms. And then they titrate and make those doses a bit bigger. And then that starts allowing people to process and integrate some of the deeper reasons for their use. So we're hoping to work with something like that in the US, and we're seeing, I mean, the opiate crisis is insane. There, you know, I think it was around 80 people a day now dying from opiate overdose, which is more than car accidents, more than like these, it's just really soaring to the top of our danger list, unfortunately. And it was also really interesting in this election to see that the counties that voted for Trump most overwhelmingly were the same communities that are suffering the most from opiate overdose deaths. And I think that's really a telling, interesting thing to me as someone who, you know, mental health worker. Addiction and drug use is a response to trauma. And so this, to me, to see that correlation, the way, you know, Trump speaks a lot to people's fears, And I think that's a really powerful thing if he's speaking to that same trauma that unfortunately is also causing people to really self-harm in other ways besides their votes. But so I'm hopeful that we might be able to develop some Ibogaine research to help target some of these populations that are really suffering a lot. There's this concept that I've been reading about recently called despair deaths. And it's basically that white men are dying at much earlier ages than they have in a long time. And they're dying from overdose, suicide, alcoholism, these, so-called despair deaths. So we think that's something that's really worth focusing on, especially in this political climate with, as I'm speaking about fear. And to me, I think so much through my lens, so many kind of problems in this world are driven by people acting from a reactionary place of fear and pain instead of from a place of like compassion or love, or these things that may sound really cheesy, but really allow you to be more thoughtful and reflective and think with a much more broad perspective than just these limited fear-based reactions. So that's why I think psychedelic healing in general is so important, and why I'm very excited to see how we can move conversations around Ibogaine research and access forward amidst this really scary opiate crisis.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm thinking about my hometown. I think a lot of people voted for Trump, and I've already had at least 3 people that I know in my life that overdosed and died from opiates, and plenty more that through association. And
sorry to hear that.
Oh yeah, it's all right. I guess it's life. But yeah, it is really interesting that this really conservative area, there's a lot of heroin and opioid crisis. But yeah, hopefully we can push through it and get some of these new medicines available. What do you think the chances are for that? Like in the policy realm?
I'm pretty optimistic, at least with our MAPS research. For example, we recently had our meeting with the FDA, which gave us the green light to continue through to phase 3, which is our final phase of research. So we're still estimating we'll have MDMA approval by 2021, and maybe even sooner, because we, after that meeting, had another meeting with the FDA where they basically said, we want to help you kind of move through the system as fast as possible because we see what an urgent population you're working with. So that was like the most encouraging, cool thing, that the FDA recognizes how important our work is and, wants to help us move forward. So, and, I guess I mentioned this in our our talk before, but we have many, people from all political backgrounds that are really benefiting from MDMA therapy for PTSD. We work with many veterans. So I'm hopeful, Trump talks a lot about wanting to support veterans, and, we do have a lot of support from that community. I'm hopeful that, we won't have some political stuff coming in and interfering with the research, because we're getting more and more support from, across the spectrum. And because we're working through the FDA was intentionally created to be insulated from political pressure. So we hope that will stand, because, they didn't want lobbyists influencing the FDA approval process. So yeah, we're cautiously optimistic. I mean, looking at broader drug policy reform, it's harder to be as optimistic looking at who Trump's appointing. And even in, the person he's appointed to head HHS, which is in charge of the FDA, it is quite worrisome. But we're hopeful that kind of the structures that are in place and protecting this medicine and that will at least allow this stuff to move forward. And cannabis as well. We're starting our cannabis for PTSD study in January. And also, I mean, they're, conservative states. Cannabis was more popular than anything else this election, way more than even in states that elected Trump, the cannabis got more votes. So, and that in combination with the kind of big business that I was mentioning before that is driving through forward cannabis, that I am a bit concerned about, but I do think that would be more likely to gain like understanding from this new administration that is probably interested in business. But I will just say that all of those, kind of with all those optimistic thoughts, I definitely am gravely concerned about a lot of other elements. And even the fact that, I started doing drug policy work because of, my interest in racial justice and social justice. And I am quite concerned by if this movement is moving forward, how it's going to be moving forward, So that's something I think we do have to be really conscious of. But I know for sure we're going to need a lot of cannabis these next 4 years. So,
yeah. And I wonder if there's, I've seen like these little scares around CBD oil being rescheduled, but I've been doing some reading on it. It seems like it's just for extractions from cannabis plants versus extractions through hemp. Maybe you know a little bit more, Joe, since you have
That's exactly. So my buddy Mike works for Bluebird Botanicals, and I know the owner too, but they exclusively do hemp, and he said we're fine because we're not using marijuana. But it totally makes sense that marijuana-derived CBDs would be classified under the same laws. Especially if you're selling THC.
From my understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing really
There's
changed. It was more that they were kind of looking the other way, and they've made more clear, like, no, this is actually the law.
So you need the hemp-derived stuff. So it makes sense, but there's this whole, what do they call it, entourage effect, where you need a certain level of THC in combination with the CBDs and whatever else to have a more beneficial effect for some therapies. So I get it. But
the entourage effect is a pretty important, I love Sanjay Gupta gave this great metaphor to describe that, which was like, you can take a vitamin, but it's never going to be as healthy, as good for you as eating a whole fruit, or a whole, and it's the same kind of thing. You can take pieces out, compounds out from cannabis that can definitely have healing properties, but it's never going to be as healthy and healing as when you have the whole entourage working together in its natural form.
Absolutely. So you had something in the recent Symposia, Can Drug Policy Be Trumped article about this healing model. You said something about psychedelics gives you the opportunity to resolve fear by re-experiencing, reprocessing it. Could you just give us a quick gloss on that?
Sure. So I think I said it allows you to kind of revisit and reprocess. So I think what that means is a lot of the deep traumas are really a difficult thing to even think. Even thinking about trauma can, besides being mentally difficult, can make you have physical reactions like heart rate, something that's really difficult for people to not only think about, but then to think about from a not fear-based space. So it's not a limited, built, constricted space. So MDMA particularly is really incredible medicine for PTSD because it reduces your fear, the part of your brain, the amygdala, that is your fear response. So you're able to not have those intense fearful responses when these traumas emerge. And in that space, you are more able to kind of have a broader perspective on your trauma and to maybe see things a bit differently and have a lot more compassion for yourself and for others involved in the situation. So that kind of allows a lot of guilt and shame and fear to be released in that process. Because also, once you start examining your fears, they're far less scary than when they're unexamined. And that doesn't mean that they're not still scary. Certainly, people go through extremely real, terrifying traumas, but it's never as scary when you're pulling, deconstructing it as when it's pushed down as this really scary thing. So MDMA allows that reprocessing. That's kind of what I mean by reprocessing, understanding it a bit differently, also associating it with different physical symptoms, maybe your heart rate doesn't go up as much when you're thinking about something. So it's literally different ways of storing that memory in your body and in your mind. And that really has incredible results later where, things don't pop up as nightmares or flashbacks or physical responses. Does that kind of
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry if that was a little tangential, but I think it's relevant in
It's important.
all of this discussion. Yeah. And we're trying to target kind of the professional audience and students interested in the field, generally speaking. And I don't know that people think with that kind of model all the time when they're approaching, issues, trauma or otherwise. Yeah. So I think it's always good to revisit. So what else is going on in your world? Are you projected like a couple years out to be working on some other interesting projects, or what do you see happening?
Nothing interesting coming. There are so many things. That's kind of part of in this December, really trying to kind of take stock and really make some decisions, because there are so many promising things and different directions to go, which I'm thrilled about. Because I can speak about something that's really near to my heart and really something I think is super important, which is that I'm working to develop studies within our MDMA for PTSD study kind of cohort. One would be focused on racial trauma or PTSD from racism, and another focused on PTSD in trans communities. So I think I'm really interested in kind of talking about how social injustice can manifest in like individual PTSD. And I think that's going to continue, I hope, to be a really important conversation. And I guess along those lines, other work I've been really thinking about is how in, the so-called kind of psychedelic community of conferences and media and these spaces, looking around and seeing how incredibly white the community is something that, I've been pretty conscious of. And I think it's really important that we as a community are starting to engage with why that is, and how we can change that. And so I think kind of anti-racist work within the psychedelic community is really important, because a lot of us I know are these, peace-loving hippie types who, have really beautiful ideals, but don't necessarily know the kind of details or the reality of certain situations. Because I've heard from so many amazing, well-intentioned people, like in this community, I don't see race. All people are the same. And the concept is, beautiful and well-intentioned, but that's also really ignoring the experience of people of color in this country that, unfortunately police officers do see race. So it's nice that this one, so just kind of breaking that conversation open, I think is super important if we're a community that really talks about healing and working, in solidarity with other social justice movements. I think that is really essential. And I have seen more and more progress on that front, but I just want to definitely flag that, because I think we have a lot of room to improve in that space.
What does that look like to you? Like, how could we heal a bit? I know the research itself is very white, really kind of bland, but, in terms of like diversity, but, how do we heal that? Like, what do you see?
Sure. So yes, the research is quite white, unfortunately. But so that's a study on focusing on racial trauma. We're working with Dr. Monica Williams in this, in process, but she's a leading researcher on PTSD from racism. And so I think working with experts and therapists of color to do outreach to their own communities. So it's not like we have to work with communities and not just kind of go in and be like, why don't you, come into our space, but rather meeting people where they are and really listening and hearing what different communities need from us and how we can best work with them. But I think really the best way when you ask, how can we heal? It's really we, as white psychedelic enthusiasts, need to do our own work and need to do our own reading, need to start asking questions. And not questions just of people of color and asking them to do this emotional labor for us, but really maybe other white people who are doing this work who might be able to help support this process. I mean, it's a really long, difficult process that requires a lot of self-reflection, which is why I think there's so much potential in our psychedelic community when we're a community so focused on being conscious and self-reflection and all of these things that are essential to understanding racial consciousness and the impact of racism on white people. There's a lot of hugely harmful pieces of racism on white people, the way that sexism deeply harms men and patriarchy, So I think it's really important that we are doing some of our own work, and that is a difficult process, but a healing one, because the more conscious we are of things, I believe that is really a way to move towards healing.
Have you ever communicated with Kalindi Ai or Dimitri Mujanis on the subject of diversity?
I've spoken to Kalindi a bit. I think his work, from my understanding, is more focused on like the kind of the mushroom work that he does.
Very divergent from the research in therapy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But I will reach out to him again. But I think this was less of his specific area of interest. But there's some. I've definitely more and more people are coming out. As I also wrote a piece for Symposia about this, and it's been really cool to see how people are responding and moving this conversation forward. So I definitely think that that's an encouraging thing. And it's also been cool that people from outside of the psychedelic community have been reaching out and saying this is resonating, and how can we bring psychedelic healing to communities of color and marginalized communities in general. Just recognizing that if we're going to be talking about healing trauma, that marginalized communities are the most traumatized. Like returning war veterans are incredibly traumatized and don't have access, don't have adequate support. But yet, compared to, someone living in a poor Black neighborhood in Atlanta, there was a study that returning war veterans had way lower rates of PTSD than people living in this community, right? And these people are also underdiagnosed and don't have the resources that even. So it's just like interesting context, because certainly we dramatically need to improve our support for veterans as well, but even just stepping back and seeing that there's so many people suffering from PTSD who have no access or no even language to understand what they're going through.
It's huge. So we have about 5 minutes left, but I'm really psyched on what we've talked about so far, and yeah, I really agree about the diversity thing. We had a long talk with Dimitri Mujanis about his criticisms. Awesome he's done some great work, but he's got some really interesting criticisms too. And we've also talked to, I forget who else we talked to.
We talked to Catherine about
Catherine McLean,
especially within the research realm. It's definitely been a conversation that's been coming up a whole lot, and I think in the past year, maybe year and a half, it's really excelled. Like it's something that. Doing a lot of research in this early on, I didn't hear too much about it, and now it's just like, yeah, everybody has a say in it, and they're really interested in talking about it. I think it's really important.
I'm really happy with how phase 3 is really geographically distributed, and I think, is there a Louisiana site?
New Orleans. I don't think we've 100% confirmed all of our sites, but I do. That definitely I think New Orleans is going to happen. We've been speaking a lot about that, and we have sites around the world as well, and not just in the U.S. And that's actually something I guess I'll mention. I forgot to that we're developing a study in Colombia, for example, for MDMA for PTSD, which will be particularly interesting. With the end of the Civil War and everything, we're really hoping to kind of engage with some of those political types of trauma as well.
That's a really hurt country, so that's going to be really meaningful, especially if they adopt it after seeing how great the results are. That's really cool.
At the UN, the Colombian health minister, when Ismail and I, my colleague from the policy team, spoke to him for a moment about MDMA therapy, and he was like, yeah, that sounds really promising. So cool. I don't know if I'm optimistic about that.
Do you have any last minute advice for maybe students or somebody to get into this policy work? Because now maybe with this fear, the new administration taking over, and we don't really know what the climate is going to look like. But any last minute advice?
Yeah. So I think that in this political climate, it's more important than ever to do work also outside of the so-called direct political system. And advocacy, even means talking to your family, your friends, kind of creating a space culturally to be supporting this work politically is the most important thing we can do. And I guess this ties back into the conversation about like the whiteness and privilege of the psychedelic space, because I totally understand that there are such a span of people who are able to speak openly about this, depending, you can be at risk for losing your job, your children, and certainly people of color are far higher risk for, being arrested for drugs or things like that. But I think that's a really powerful part of kind of recognizing, being conscious of your privilege in this community, that if you feel safe enough to speak in certain communities and speak out, that it's super important to do that and use that privilege to kind of move the conversation forward. Because I think that's, my work in this policy and advocacy realm, I'm definitely thinking a lot more about the community building and advocacy side in these times. And because it's the most important of any movement needs to start from the community and the people anyway to really make the kind of change I'm looking for on a policy level. So I think there's so many ways for people to get involved. I know MAPS alone has 1 million volunteer opportunities, or will help you host a global psychedelic dinner if you want help, inviting people in your community and having things to talk about. But I encourage people also to just think of whatever they're most passionate about and do that, and see how psychedelics can kind of intersect with that and how they can speak in their space. Someone reached out to me who's a graphic designer, and he's like, I just want to work, do something for MAPS. And I was like, well, we would love the help from graphic designer. Let's use those skills to work with this. It doesn't all have to be about research or direct thing. And that is really what we need, the variety of different people working in all different disciplines to be integrating psychedelics into their work and into their world. So, yeah.
Cool. So how can, awesome. I really appreciate it. And do you have a website or any place people can reach out to you or check up on your work?
Well, the MAPS website is maps.org, and you can find stuff about me there and reach me through there, or on Twitter. You guys first contacted me, definitely works, at Natalie_Lila, Lyla. I recently changed my handle from @RespectTheGins because I thought it was time, but so for people who are not confused, this is a new update. Those are great ways. And then also on Facebook, I post a lot of articles, so you can follow me on Facebook. I post probably more than on Twitter. But yeah.
All right, we'll link you all up in the notes.
Cool.
Thanks again, Natalie, for joining us on the show. I really appreciate it, and hope to talk to you again soon.
It's great to speak to you both. Thanks for all your awesome work with these podcasts.